50 votes. Logged in the official Senate record at 11:39 p.m. on June 5, 2026. For 12 straight months, every network, every Democratic strategist, every pundit with a cable contract told you this bill was dead, could not get a majority, would never reach the president's desk. The Save America Act was the bill Washington had buried, eulogized, and moved on from. And then Mike Lee of Utah played a card nobody saw coming. And Susan Collins of Maine, who had voted no less than an hour earlier, switched. And the Senate record logged 50 votes in favor of the Save America Act for the first time in the life of this bill. That number, 50, is the number that changes everything. Because 50 votes plus one vice president named JD Vance equals a majority of the United States Senate. Not a symbol, not a talking point. A documented majority in the official record that Minority Leader Chuck Schumer cannot explain away and the press has not fully reckoned with. I'm Susan Kokinda with Susan Report News. Here is what I am covering today. First, why 50 is the number that matters, and what the zombie filibuster actually is, because you cannot understand this fight without understanding the weapon being used to block a documented majority. Second, how Mike Lee engineered the vote that produced those 50. The sequence, the timing, and why the clean bill did what the loaded bill could not. Third, where JD Vance fits into the architecture of what comes next, and why his role is more than ceremonial. And fourth, the two roads to the president's desk, who controls each one, and the bottleneck that is not Chuck Schumer. Let's start with the weapon. Part 1. The zombie in the room. There is a piece of Senate history the daily coverage never explains, and without it, nothing about this fight makes sense. Picture 1957. A senator named Strom Thurmond takes the floor of the United States Senate and begins to speak. He does not stop. He speaks through the afternoon, through the night, for more than 24 consecutive hours. The longest floor speech in Senate history, all to block a civil rights bill. That was the filibuster in its original form. It was physical. It cost you your voice, your stamina, and your dignity. It happened in full public view. If you wanted to stop a bill, the entire country watched you do it. Then, in the 1970s, the Senate changed the rules. The chamber adopted a two-track system, which meant that instead of forcing blockers to physically stand and hold the floor, the Senate could simply set a stalled bill aside and move on to other business. From that point forward, stopping legislation required no speech, no stamina, no spectacle. A minority could kill a bill from behind a desk. No cameras, no explanation, no visible cost. Mike Lee has a name for what the filibuster became after that change: the zombie filibuster. Dead as an actual practice. Nobody stands, nobody talks, and yet it still shambles around the Capitol blocking things that have majority support. Here is the fact that should make you stop and think. The 60-vote threshold everyone treats as sacred has already been eliminated, twice, once by each party. In 2013, Harry Reid and Senate Democrats eliminated the filibuster for most presidential nominations. In 2017, Mitch McConnell extended that same move to Supreme Court picks so Neil Gorsuch could be confirmed. The precedent is not theoretical. Both parties have swung the sledgehammer when it suited them. Keep that in your back pocket. Because the man who built half of that precedent is now one of the 4 Republicans who has been blocking this bill. And his objection is a procedural argument made by a man who has already broken the procedure he is defending. That is the context you are not getting anywhere else. Part 2. The bill, the wall, and the 4 names. The Save America Act does 2 things. When you register to vote in a federal election, you show documentary proof of United States citizenship. And when you cast your ballot, you show a photo ID. That is the entirety of it. The broader version adds a ban on no-excuse mail voting and takes effect immediately upon passage. Not in 2028, not after a gentle transition period, immediately. Which means the 2026 midterms would be run under the new rules. The House passed a version of this in April 2025, passed an updated version in February 2026. Both times it crossed to the Senate and sat there, because the Senate requires 60 votes to defeat a filibuster, and every Democratic senator is opposed. 53 Republican seats minus 60 equals a 7-vote gap that persuasion will never close. But the gap was not just Democrats. 4 Republicans joined the blockade. Their names matter. Mitch McConnell of Kentucky argued the bill hands future presidents sweeping authority over elections that should belong to the states. A federalism argument made in his own words in the Wall Street Journal. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska argued the bill as written would disenfranchise her constituents, pointing to the fact that 20% of Alaska's population has no road connection to the state system, meaning some voters would literally board a plane to deliver a birth certificate to an election official. Tom Tillis of North Carolina said flatly he would do everything he could to prevent it from moving forward. And Susan Collins of Maine, hold that name. In March, the Senate voted to open debate on the bill, and 51 senators said yes. But 51 is not 60, and the floor effort ran out of oxygen. In April, Senator John Kennedy tried to bolt the bill onto a budget package. Failed, 48-50, with all 4 Republican names voting no. The Senate parliamentarian then ruled the bill ineligible for the reconciliation package under the Byrd Rule, which requires that anything traveling through reconciliation be genuinely budgetary in nature. Door closed. 2 House passages, 2 failed Senate pushes, 4 Republican holdouts, a parliamentarian ruling, and Schumer performing the funeral rites from the microphone. If you were placing a bet in early June, you bet against this bill. Everyone did. Part 3. Mike Lee's card. The night of June 5, 2026. The Senate was locked in a vote-a-rama, the all-night amendment marathon that gets attached to major legislation. Republicans were moving a $70 billion immigration enforcement package. Hour after hour, amendment after amendment, while most of the country slept. Senator Lindsey Graham went first. His version of the Save America Act was the loaded version. Citizenship verification, photo ID, plus additional provisions Trump had demanded, including language barring men from women's sports. Graham's amendment failed, 48-50. Collins, Murkowski, McConnell, Tillis. The same 4 names, the same wall. Anyone still watching at that hour probably figured the story had ended the way it always ends. It had not, because Mike Lee was holding a second card, and he understood something about Collins that Graham's amendment had obscured. Lee waited. Then he introduced the original House-passed Save America Act. No additions, no riders, no extra provisions. Stripped down to the exact text the House had already approved. The clean bill. Not the loaded version that gave Collins additional grounds for objection. The version she had already said, in a written statement in February, that she supported. Susan Collins switched. She had voted no on Graham's loaded version less than an hour earlier. She voted yes on Lee's clean text. The amendment received 50 votes in favor, 49 against. The official Senate record logs it as vote number 151, June 5, 2026, 11:39 p.m. Sit with what that sequence tells you. Collins did not oppose the core bill. She opposed what had been attached to it. Lee's move was not complicated. It was precise. Strip the bill to its clean form, the form she had already endorsed on paper, and her stated objection disappears. Lee understood the difference between a persuasion problem and a drafting problem. Graham had a persuasion problem. Lee solved a drafting problem. That is the whole explanation for why one amendment failed and the other produced 50 votes. Mike Lee went to X while the vote-a-rama was still running and wrote that, but for the zombie filibuster, the House-passed Save America Act would already be on its way to the White House for President Trump's signature. Not the votes. The votes exist now. The procedure is what's blocking them. He was right. And that statement, made public, on the record, with the vote number to back it up, is the argument that reshapes the entire September battlefield. Part 4, where JD Vance fits. 50 votes is a majority of the United States Senate only under one condition. The vice president is available to break the tie. JD Vance is that vice president. This is not a ceremonial role in the architecture of what comes next. The Constitution assigns the vice president the role of president of the Senate specifically to break tied votes, and on a reconciliation bill, which passes by simple majority and cannot be filibustered. 50 Republican votes plus Vance equals passage. The math is that direct. What Lee's June 5th vote proved is that the 50 exist. What it did not prove is that the procedure can be structured to use them, because the zombie filibuster still stands. The vote-a-rama amendment cannot pass legislation. It can only demonstrate support. The actual bill still has to travel through a floor process that requires either 60 votes or a procedural vehicle that bypasses the threshold. Vance's role becomes decisive in both scenarios. In the reconciliation scenario, if Republicans produce a grant structure version of the Save America Act that the parliamentarian blesses as budgetary, money flowing to states that implement voter ID and proof of citizenship requirements rather than a federal mandate, that bill passes by simple majority, 50 votes plus Vance. The parliamentarians' previous ruling was against the mandate structure. The grant structure is a direct response to that ruling. Senate Republicans, including Roger Marshall of Kansas, who sits on the Budget Committee, have said publicly they believe the grant language can survive the Byrd Rule if it is written with precision. In the talking filibuster scenario, if Majority Leader Thune forces a genuine floor filibuster, dragging the zombie back to 1957, requiring the opposition to physically hold the floor, voice after voice, hour after hour, and the opposition eventually exhausts itself, the final vote is 50 plus Vance. The same math, the same outcome. Both roads run through the vice president, and Vance has made his position clear throughout this administration. He supports the bill. He has said so publicly and consistently. What he is waiting for is a Senate floor process that gives him the vote to break. The question is not whether Vance will cast that vote. The question is whether Thune will create the conditions for it. Part 5. The bottleneck is not Schumer. Here is the thing that the daily coverage keeps misreading. Schumer is not the obstacle. He is the loudest voice in the room and the least relevant to the outcome. A minority leader whose entire conference is in opposition cannot stop a reconciliation bill and cannot stop a properly forced filibuster. His power in this fight is exactly zero if the majority decides to use the tools available to it. The bottleneck is John Thune. The Senate Majority Leader controls the floor schedule. He decides what comes up for a vote, when, and in what procedural posture. He has told colleagues repeatedly that he cannot trust the Republican conference to hold together through a vote-a-rama barrage. The flood of Democratic amendments designed to generate attack ads against vulnerable incumbents heading into November. He has warned that a talking filibuster could paralyze the Senate for weeks. He said himself, "We could stay here until Christmas, and the Democrats still won't vote for this." He is not wrong about the tactical difficulty. A vote-a-rama is a genuine weapon, and the history of Senate conferences breaking under sustained amendment pressure is real. But here is the problem with Thune's position stated plainly. The majority leader of the United States Senate, holding 53 seats, with a documented 50-vote majority for his president's top legislative priority, is telling his conference and his president that he cannot manage his own members well enough to advance the bill. That is not a Schumer problem. That is a conference management problem. Mike Lee understood this, which is why his pressure campaign after June 5th was not directed at Democrats. It was directed at Thune. Lee formally warned leadership he would object to any effort to put the Senate into recess for August until the Save America Act had been advanced. He told Thune publicly, "Do not assume you have my consent. You do not." And he posted the summary of the moment in one sentence. The Senate does not need a summer vacation as much as the country needs the Save America Act. That pressure produced a deal, but not the one Lee wanted. Friday night, before the August recess, Thune, Trump, and Senate conservatives reached an agreement to defer the full reconciliation push until September. Instead of the budget resolution and the full reconciliation pathway, the Senate voted on a stripped-down voter ID-only bill. Senator John Hoeven's version, Photo ID Alone, the most popular piece. They dared the Senate to vote it down. The Senate voted it down. Lee called the failure tragic. Then he said, "We are not done. We are just getting started." That statement is not spin. It is a description of where the September fight actually begins. Part 6, September and the walls that are already moving. Here is the board as it stands when the Senate returns in September. The wall of 4 is already collapsing from within, and not because of anything Democrats did. MC Cannell and Tillis have both decided against seeking re-election. 2 of the 4 names that built this wall are walking off the field permanently. They will not be in the Senate when the next Congress is seated. Their votes, which have blocked this bill at every critical moment, will not be there to block the next version. Collins has already crossed over on the clean bill. Her condition: no additional provisions, no riders, the House passed text, and nothing else. is satisfied by Lee's drafting approach. She is on record at 11:39 p.m. on June 5th as the 50th vote. That leaves Murkowski. She is not on the ballot this cycle. The near-term math does not run through her. It runs around her. The grant structure reconciliation bill, by design, is voluntary. States that can implement the requirements draw down the funding. States that cannot or choose not to simply do not receive it. The federal mandate argument that anchors her objection applies with considerably less force to a voluntary incentive program. The August drafting window was specifically designated to produce language that survives the parliamentarians' Byrd Rule review on exactly that theory. Rushed text fails on Byrd Rule review. Precise text survives. August was the drafting window. September is when the language meets the referee. What the September fight looks like is this: a grant structure reconciliation bill, drafted through August, reviewed by the parliamentarian, brought to the floor with 50 votes secured. Collins on record, Murkowski potentially neutralized by the voluntary structure, MC Cannell and Tillis gone or irrelevant, Vance in the chair. The zombie filibuster, by design, cannot touch it. There are honest obstacles still on the table. The House reconciliation package did not include spending offsets, and Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, taking over the budget gavel, has said he will insist on adding them. That is a real negotiation that has to happen fast inside a very compressed legislative calendar, a handful of working days between Labor Day and October campaign season. The parliamentarian may still rule against the grant structure. Republican conference discipline under a vote-a-rama is an unresolved question that Thune has legitimate reason to worry about. None of those obstacles are Democratic obstacles. They are all Republican obstacles. The party that controls the Senate, the House, and the White House has to decide whether its own procedural concerns are larger than its president's top legislative priority. Mike Lee has already answered that question for himself. JD Vance has answered it for himself. The 50 senators who voted yes on June 5th answered it in the official record. The debate is no longer about whether a majority of the Senate supports the Save America Act. That question has been settled. Logged as vote number 151, preserved in the official record of the United States Senate. The debate is about one question now. Does a procedural invention from the 1970s, a zombie that nobody has to feed or defend publicly, get to overrule a House majority, a Senate majority, and a sitting president simultaneously? Or does the majority use the tools both parties have already used in living memory when the stakes were high enough? Thune has to answer that. Before November, before the window closes. Lee and Vance have given him 50 votes and a tiebreaker. Everything else is a choice. That is the fight that is actually happening. The press is covering the surface. This channel covers the mechanism. I'm Susan Kokinda with Susan Report News. If you want to be here when the parliamentarian rules on the grant structure in September, and that ruling changes everything, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Drop a comment. Should Thune force the talking filibuster and make the opposition hold that floor? Or is protecting the 60-vote threshold worth stalling the president's top bill? Yes or no? I read every one. The next video covers what the vote-a-rama actually looked like from inside the chamber that night, and why the outcome was not what either side had planned going in.